This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with artist and author Edmund de Waal. De Waal's artwork is characterized by large collections of his handmade pottery, which are carefully arranged within specially designed vitrines, while his books, like his New York Times bestseller, The Hare with Amber Eyes, examine the past through the personal stories that objects can tell. Themes of origin, belonging, memory, and legacy permeate all of his work. And now, a conversation about memory and materiality with artist Edmund de Waal. Thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Edmund, I wanted to speak with you because you have shows coming up at Gagosian in New York, and you're just such an interesting person. I just know your head is full of so many interesting things. You know, a lot of times with the artists, though, Edmund, I like to start with a hypothetical, which is, if you were to be seated at a dinner party next to a complete stranger who had no idea who you are or what your work consists of, where do you even start to explain that to them?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on your podcast, Greg. It's lovely to be in conversation with you. I hate dinner parties. So, you know, if you caught me at a dinner party, that would be an interesting moment to start. If you caught me somewhere else, I think, and that asked me that question, I mean, I would find it really difficult because, you know, I have a sort of plural existence of making things and writing about them. But under pressure, outside that dinner party, if you ask me that question again, I'd say that I'm a potter. I'd say that what I do and what I've always done is to make objects out of clay, make vessels, things which have an interior space, volume, and put them down in the world somewhere. And that's my kind of principle. That's what I do. Perhaps that's the end of the podcast. That's what I do, Craig.
Well, it's been a pleasure having you with me today.
Thank you so much.
But no, you know, I think for many artists, that identity, I mean, I feel like you are stating that your identity is that you make pots. That identity is something that as a child, we kind of brand ourselves with what in our mind sets us apart from someone else, whether that's I'm fast or I'm better at maths or whatever. So I imagine there in your youth, you had a moment where you realized that this was something that was yours.
Yeah. So I had a moment. I mean, the thing for me was it happened very early, Craig. So, and by the way, if you hear noises in the background, that's the noises of big crates of objects being sent off around the world. So that we're in the middle of a studio. We're on a podcast, so you can't see there are books behind me and objects all around me. And in fact, and actually objects on my table, which we may come to as well. But so the you bring childhood up rightly and talk about foundational stories, or you know, about how you begin or how you identify your place in the world. And for me, I was 5, for goodness sake, and was taken to an evening class by my dad, which was a pottery class. And I made my first pot then. And it wasn't that I was good at it at all. I mean, I was 5, for God's sake, on a potter's wheel. But there was something about that, a metamorphosis of a lump of earth into an object in no time at all that seemed to me utterly compelling. And I went back the next day, you know, and then I kept going. And so that's, I mean, I'm on the cusp of 60, so that's 55 years, you know, of making pots. And obviously, you know, the pots have changed in that time, and the meaning has changed. But that central image of making a hollow object, making a space, remains utterly compelling for me.
I find your story very personal to myself because I started painting when I was 9. And, I feel like for decades, I was reaching or trying to ascertain a sense of precision and a
Yeah.
sense of accuracy. And it was only as I approached that I realized that's not what it's all about.
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like you would have something to say about that.
So, I mean, I do actually. Thank you for asking. This dinner party is actually beginning to really be quite fun. So of course, that's many decades of this stuff, and it's many decades of traveling, and thinking about this. And of course, there were decades of apprenticeship at the heart of this. So decades of trying to have enough motor skills, have enough somatic knowledge, tacit knowledge about how you make things in the world out of clay. I ran away from school at 17 to Japan, to be a potter there, and then I took a couple of years as an apprentice in the UK, and then I did an English degree. But and then I set up a studio workshop in the Welsh mountains, making what I felt I ought to make, which was functional, heavy domestic wear. So for a long period of my time of my life, I felt that the functionality of objects had to be overt, that they had to proclaim, I have to say rather earnestly and doggedly and somewhat heavily, that to have a place in the world as a thing, you had to say, I am a soup bowl, I am an espresso cup, I am a casserole. I'm much older than you. We used to make casseroles in the 70s.
Yes, I remember casseroles.
Well, yeah,
Corningware and yes.
But that idea of it's sort of contramundum. It was sort of oppositional in some way. Here I am as a moral center, as a maker, making things which you will change your life. You'll buy my soup bowls. You will make your soup, and that will transform the way in which the pace of your life. And it took me a very long time, and I had to write a couple of books to kind of unpick all that kind of landscape of moralized making, and to discover something different. And the something different I found was play, was pleasure, and we might get there, to that whole otherness.
It's really interesting. Having a podcast like this allows me an incredible opportunity to talk to very interesting people who I admire as artists. And in the last month, in what will be published in a short sequence of episodes, are conversations with William Kentridge, Wolfgang Tillmans, and you. And all three of you are circling in on some of the same things, and all three of you have talked about the necessity for play.
Right.
And William Kentridge would talk about kind of thinking disassociatively, like when he is at the wall with his charcoal, he just asks himself to just make, explore, be, just kind of out of himself and to play. And then later he, thinks of himself as critic. And can you talk more about play? Because, again, all three of you have brought up exploring through play.
I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled that to be in conjunction with Kentridge, who I admire enormously, and indeed Wolfgang. But Kentridge's idea of play feels very parallel, actually, curiously, to my own. But so for me, play, material play, the I'm waving my arms around as I talk to you because, of course, it's about
It's okay. Gesticulating is fine. It helps us speak.
It helps me. It's impossible for me not to wave my arms around because, of course, actually, for me, play is profoundly um, the bodily exploration of the world. So it's basically making a mess in the world. It's not the tidying up of the world into by stricture or by diktat into thinking this is the shape of what I want to make. It's thinking your way through exploration of possibilities through porcelain vessels in my case, and then other materials too. I mean, this last 6 months I've been playing with silver, which is a beautiful material, and I've been oxidizing it and banging hammers with it and doing and tearing it. And this new exhibition, which is about to begin in New York, is full of black porcelain, which is new, porcelain which is full of manganese and cobalt and all these things. So black porcelain and silver. And that came about through play. It came about through trying out things in the world and seeing how they sat together and how they sang together, how they made noise together in the world. Why does it matter? Sorry, I'm asking questions I feel you're asking me.
No.
Why does it matter? It matters because it is only through play that we discover this essential part of being a human being, which is homo ludens. It's the playful aspect of the gratuitous, of doing something for pleasure, not of necessity. I'm going to put my hands down. It's so important.
I feel like it's also probably one of the few ways that we can get to our subconscious, right? Like, our dreams are kind of manifestations of our subconscious, but it's antithetical to think that you can consciously get to your subconscious. Yeah. And, it seems like play is one of the few ways that we can kind of find our way there because we're exploring in a free and an uninhibited way with our mind.
Absolutely. There's lots of knowledge that comes out of play. And of course, what you do with that knowledge and how you work with it is, of course, a whole different thing. And that is discipline. That's the editorial thing that William is talking about. If it was just play, I wouldn't write book. I wouldn't be able to publish books which had the reach that they do, or I wouldn't be doing, this, that, and the other. But that core bit of play has to be kept alive, and that's quite private. That's something that has to be given its own time and its own space. Just actually curiously in parallel, if you looked at my notebooks, which I'm not suggesting you do for a minute, they're full of lists and quotations and jottings and crossings out. Actually, on the wall behind me there is a huge installation, which is a vast wall piece, which is an installation about crossing things out, about erasure, about rewriting things. So all these kinds of inscription, rescription, and erasure, all part of play too.
Well, it's reminding me even more of William Kentridge, right? Just this practice of erasure and remarking. But I feel like both of you have a true passion for the literary and taking inspiration from the literary. Can you talk about some of those influences that wind up in your work?
I've always written. Great. I've always written, and poetry has been a constant since childhood as well. And so a lot of my work is actually in dialogue with poets, and people who have I can't say adopted. They've sort of adopted me. I mean, poets whose over the decades have become increasingly significant to me. The great poet of the German language of the 20th century, Paul Celan, whose family was killed in the Shoah, and whose struggle with the German language produced powerful new ways of sort of writing through brokenness, really through broken language. Hugely important to me. In fact, all my relationship with shards, with broken pottery, has been very, very important. In fact, Anselm Kiefer asked me to write about him and Celan for his last Paris exhibition, which I did. So Celan, hugely important. But then, in these exhibitions in which are just coming up in New York, this fall, there's Emily Dickinson, who's again, but the fragmentary Dickinson, the kind of the way in which her poems are full of ellipses and strange caesuras and gaps. Very important for me about how I place vessels in my vitrines, which of course are in some ways like pages of books. I've started writing into porcelain and then breaking bits of porcelain. There's all kinds of stuff. How long have we got?
It's funny. I talked to some artists, and they will be like, "Well, I don't talk because I make, or I make because I don't talk. The words are not my way. It's my form of expression." But like I said, there are other artists like you that I feel like your head is overflowing with words, and this format welcomes verbosity.
Well, you've lucked out, mate. The part of this, Greg, of course, is that a lot of my practice is rooted in really complicated bits of history. It's rooted in my own Jewish family's extremely traumatic history of loss and exile. And that's which took me which ended up in the book, but 15 years ago, that the Hare with Amber Eyes, but it also, that experience of writing that book over a decade and then publishing it and then its afterlife have also meant that I've spent a huge amount of my life in archives, right, in complicated places, looking at manuscripts, looking for gaps in libraries, looking at objects with strange provenance, looking at buildings that were looted, looking at families that were so all that stuff, of course, brings me into language. It also brings me into really complicated silences and spaces and gaps. So for me, that becomes actual in books, but also absolutely becomes my work, my exhibitions, my interventions in the Musée Camondo, into the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna, into the Frick, or wherever. So you want language? Fine, but you also want silences. And how do those two things sit in the world?
It's almost like your vitrines are representing these very solid known events in these unknown negative spaces that have just been lost to time. And because you do such a wonderful job in your writing of taking us to a specific place, and we can feel and touch and smell this moment. But that's just a moment. There's so much in between those pieces, right?
The books are really trying to sort of test out what it is to witness something in the world, to find where those traces of witness are still present, and to tune into that, if that makes sense. And it can be a building, it can be an object, it can be a letter in an archive. So to test that out, and for me, that's absolutely the same thing, Craig. That's what I'm trying to do with a vitrine. As you, thank you for saying that, because that's absolutely, and of course, there's a sort of back history of vitrines in my own family story, which is that it was a vitrine of objects, which was the only thing that allowed me access to this, to the story, my own family story. But the vitrine is also a way of pausing the kind of traffic of the world, the traffic of objects, the traffic of ideas and sound in the world into a particular space, and letting it just sort of sit there, it was like a kind of John Cage score, that sits there and can be sounded if you feel that you want to.
We were attempting to have a conversation the other day. We ran into technical difficulties, all my fault. And I said that, I'm sure that it's a sign that I'm intended to have some other kernel of a question or revelation before us resuming this call. Several questions came up, but the one thing that struck me, the longer I looked at your vitrines, when I first saw the work for this show, that's up in New York with the black and the positive and negative space, and my first inclination was, oh, this reminds me of Louise Nevelson, right? But the longer I looked at it, I was struck that it reminded me of something in DNA sequencing called gel electrophoresis. And it's, basically the shape and pattern of your DNA when it's tested. And it struck me that that's incredibly poetic, that your work struck me as being some visual manifestation of gene sequencing.
That's amazing. I mean, that hadn't occurred to me. I'm thrilled by that. I'll take Louise Nevelson any day, but I love the idea of that. Can I immediately read you from my last book, The Letters to Camando, about identity and about which it actually speaks to DNA, where I actually, in America, people keep saying, are you coming back? Are you returning to being Jewish? A very American question. It's like pointing a finger. Are you? And I deflect and I say, and my father is a half Jewish Anglican clergyman. My mother is the daughter of a country vicar and a historian, and I've been brought up in the Church of England in monasteries, in cathedrals, and I've written about the Quakers, and I read Zen Buddhist poetry, and I love the Psalms as they cross over everything. They're the proper poems of exile. And I'm half English and a quarter Dutch and a quarter Austrian and completely European, and I'm not sure what I'm coming back to. I think I'm a mongrel. I think I'm a lapsed everything, but I do know what commitment to an idea looks like, and that I do know that there are ways of making something extraordinary out of dispersion and of countering the silence of disdain. And that's absolutely me saying, DNA, what's passed on, and what do you do with what's passed on, and how do you understand, what you're carrying forward into the world? So thank you for that.
That's what I always love, and I talk about artists, the viewers share. I mean, we can put work out there, and if we do it right, it's only half finished, and yes, the viewer fills in all those lovely gaps with what's in their own head. And yeah, even if art making is a solitary monastic practice, in the end, it's a collaboration with the viewer.
Yeah, which is why if you look at the shelves behind me, you will see book after book after book of John Cage, and indeed Morton Feldman, actually more recently, all of whose ideas about the interaction, the creativity of play, uh, by collectively and personally. So that's people dropping things in the studio in the background, probably pots. But the idea of collectively and personally being involved in the creation of a new work by looking, moving, talking about it, sounding it out in the world, feels to me absolutely beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And actually, sorry, postscript, in this new exhibition, I've done my first pieces of work with stone. I've made a series of places where people can sit within the exhibition, in order to kind of get that entirely that kind of engagement and movement and pausing in the world.
Tell me more about this particular exhibit. I mean, I imagine it is inspired by some prose, and it looks like there's an increased spectrum of materiality. We're beyond just porcelain that's been fired. It's there's a whole. You're turning into an alchemist.
Well, if you came to the studio, or sorry, when you come to the studio here, and you come down to this my kiln room, it is an alchemist's bench. It's full of trials of things in the world, trialing them out. And like all good alchemists, of course, it's full of failure and things that have gone wrong. It's also full of shards of broken things. And so this exhibition deals both with the intact, and the repaired and the broken. So you're absolutely right. It's full of different materials. There's silver, and there's alabaster, and there's marble, as well as porcelain, in this exhibition. But you will also see that on the very edges of these black porcelain bowls, there's a tiny piece of silver, which is a form of kintsugi, a Japanese technique of mending. In fact, here is a 12th century example in my hands at the moment, as it happens. So there are lots of material responses to how objects have survived just in the world, and then putting them down. So the great marble benches I've made, have written onto very, very thin sheets of silver, written the text in, and then folded them and then inserted them like they're sort of prayers into a wall. So there are all these moments of sort of touch and response, and hiddenness, within the show.
There's just so many different things I would love to talk to you about. Let me ask you about tactility and your work as they're displayed in vitrines. Is there an invitation to interact with the individual components, or is it your goal for someone not to just look but to touch?
Well, I've removed that by having them in within vitrines, and that's both a kind of I get asked, why can't we touch these objects? And the reason for that, of course, is that what I'm trying to do is simply pause them, so that they're not in motion in the world. And if they were touched, that would keep on going. So, there are parts of my work that you can touch. And in fact, my new work with stone is absolutely about that. I'm making work that you absolutely run your hands over and find things. I made work for I made a beautiful Japanese thing called the tsukubai, which is a place for richly hand washing, before to building. I've been doing work with marble and water in that way. But my vessels are held back from touch. You can see that they were touched very obviously, but actually you can't touch them. And that also relates, I suppose, to sort of, you know, you can't move the words round in my book, actually, but you can still read them and they can still move in your head. So it's that kind of correspondence.
I've heard you speak of these displays as feeling like notes of music on a sheet. And obviously, if you move the notes, it will be a different song, right? And again, this is going back to a conversation I was having yesterday with Wolfgang Tillmans, is very much part of his practice is in the exhibition, bringing together the collective and how do these pieces sing. You're asking the viewer to appreciate the components individually, but as the collective, it's something else.
A part of me, I've got a very strong image that's just come into my head, which is of sitting on a very beautiful wooden floor in Kyoto, looking out at the rock garden of Roanji, one of the wonderful rocks and the rake grass, the rake sand,
Right.
With the great wall, beaten wall behind it, and the Temere behind it, and that feeling that the objects are both simultaneously completely still in this extraordinary, powerful sort of metabolic movement at the same time. And it's a very deep experience of the stiller you sit, the more movement you find within that space and within the objects within that space. And so, in a funny kind of way, that's my installations are, I hope, moving towards that experience of being able to have enough going on and enough invitation within them to hold you, hold your attention, hold your intellect, hold you bodily, and you can feel the movement within them, that field of movement within them. That's an aspiration.
When you describe that scene, you describe that aspiration within your work, and mentally I'm looking at this work that you just completed of these black vitrines. My mind instantly jumps to the Rothko Chapel. It's kind of everything that you've just described, and I would imagine that you would hope that somebody would, given the imitation of the bench and what's in front of them, that they would have a similar sort of experience.
Thank you. I mean, that's entirely. I would love that. I would love that. I mean, I would absolutely love that. And you didn't know, but I've been playing Morton Feldman's Rothko Chapel over the last year in the studio. So I cannot tell you how tuned in that is, Craig, to the experience. And of course, listening to Morton Feldman's work in relation to Rothko, part of what's going on there is the simple extension of time and attention. So it's simply saying that actually it's possible to really slow your heart rate down, to slow your hearing down in the world, and discover something extraordinary about yourself through that process, and I guess massive aspiration. That's what I'd love to do. That's kind of what I would absolutely love to think could happen.
I feel like listening to you speak before and talking with other artists, it seems like there are certain common denominators, and one of them, especially with really great artists, and I'm not just trying to flatter you, but there is a point in their arc where they realize that there is a bigger aspiration, that they're capable of making work on a different scale with more ambition. Can you talk about what that moment was for you?
Well, I'm not going to. I'm first of all, I'm going to deflect like crazy. I mean, I've just told you about how English as well as European I am. So, it's not about. But I will accept the challenge about what point. There was a point of inflection 3-4 years ago for me when I made a work which was shown during the last but one Venice Biennale. And it was a work in two parts, Greg. One part was a response to the ghetto. It was an invitation to work within the 15th and 16th century synagogues in the ghetto, which is quite some invitation. And I made work which sat briefly within those sacred spaces there. And I realized that was working through a whole series of things to do with the Psalms and all kinds of stuff. And the other thing I needed to do in Venice at that moment was to make a new library, and I made a library of exile, which was a sort of my first ever pavilion. It was like it was a very substantial space. The walls of the pavilion were covered in porcelain slip, liquid porcelain, in which I'd written a history of all the destroyed libraries of the world, from Alexandria all the way through to Mosul, including the looting of my great-grandfather's library. That was the outside. And inside, 4 huge installations of porcelain and marble. And then 2,500 books written by refugees and by exiles from Ovid onwards. And it was a space you could sit and read, and all 80 languages, Craig, imagine it. And you picked a book up, opened it up, and it had an ex libris plate. And if the book mattered to you, you wrote your name because that book mattered to you. And so it was a place of activity and of children coming, we did poetry readings, dance, music. And I had a box there where I said, if there's a book that you feel needs to be in this library, tell me and I'll buy it, which of course was a stupid thing to say because I had to buy 1,500 books for this library. But that mattered because that whole project, then the library went to Dresden and it came to the British Museum. And now that library is in Iraq, in Mosul, in where there was a library which was destroyed. And that told me as a project that you can actually do something in the world that will touch not just, people who go to galleries, but you can talk directly into kind of experience of the commonality and particularity of where do you come from, where do you want to be, what have you lost, what are you passing on? So building that library, making it an active, possible space, made a first pavilion, and now I'm doing more, and you'll see them over the next few years, and it was massively empowering. I'm sorry, I'm leaning into my computer screen here with my excitement, Craig. Yeah, so and that's me as a potter, as a writer, but also as someone sort of staking a claim for people being able to come in and write their names in books. That was my inflection point.
You have spent countless hours in archives, delving into your family history, tracing the roots of your craft. All those hours in archives, have they changed the way you think about archiving your own work? And do you think about that period when Edmund is no longer with us and what stories are going to be left through your hands?
Goodness. Well, that's a killer question. I mean, questions. Okay, number one, yes, of course, I think about archives. I think about my own archive and what to do, and in fact, actually, I I've given our whole family archive to the Jewish Museum in Vienna, where can be looked after, and I'm just on the point of handing over an archive to a museum in this country too. But and my archival principle is such that is that if you look at my desk here in front of me, you will see
stacks.
You'll see archives in different stages of of complexity, and in fact, actually, yes. But what happens next, or what happens when I died? I don't know. I mean, some things exist briefly in the world. Some things get happily lost, which is not a bad thing. The privilege of having been able to write things and to have made things is that all my work will end up as shards, as broken things. But it's impossible to get rid of broken pots. They end up in the earth, and someone 2,000 years later walks across a hillside and, like I did, bends down and picks up a broken piece of pottery, and you're away. So roll on a hillside somewhere and a couple of broken pots, and things continue. You can't own what happens next.
So, Edmund, you actually have two shows going on with Gagosian, right?
Yeah.
So the one I think we've mainly been speaking of, but then there's another one that's sort of shared inspiration with Sally Mann. Can you talk a little bit about that? That's also coming up.
I mean, this is such a joy. This is such a joy, Craig. This is more than 10 years of conversation and friendship here. Sally got to know me through my book, The Hare with Amber Eyes, which Cy Twombly gave her. And then we started corresponding, and we met, and we've done conversations together, and we sort of walked together in Virginia and been here in the studio. And some years ago, quite a few years ago, we said, let's see whether we could show our work in the same space at the same time, see what happens, be present together. And we've been shaping this exhibition now for a long time. And, I'm so drawn to Sally's work, which is so powerfully to do with identity, of course, and also to do with place. Her extraordinary images of the South and battlefields. How I'm so drawn to her as a writer. So the doubleness of our lives of being, both writing and making, and she's been working, I've been working, we've been sharing images together, and now we've kind of jointly curated this extraordinary, I hope, room of her new work, tintypes and my. And my installations in the same space, and we've had a conversation together, which is also being published. So I simply can't wait.
As you tell that story, it strikes me that I'm certain there was a point 15 years ago where it felt like writing A Hare with Amber Eyes could have felt like a diversion and a distraction, but it seems like it has opened up an entire world for your practice that you would have never had you not chosen to pursue the creation of that book. And it kind of goes back to what we were saying about play, if that makes sense.
It makes complete sense. And in fact, actually, that takes me straight back to Sally, of course, because, no one says to Sally, you've got to spend years of your life writing Hold Still, to really profoundly do that kind of that deep archaeology about place and family and public, attention and politics, and no one tells you You've got to do these things. You actually risk it. And in some ways, sometimes it's not a chosen path at all. It feels just like a compulsion or something that you need to come to the end of. And then you find out what happens. And I think for both of us, it's enlarged the world. It's made our other practice more discursive. It's made other people understand or connect more profoundly to what we're doing. So, it's an expanded field, to use that hackneyed phrase. But it doesn't feel like it's going to happen when it's 3 a.m. and you know this, when you're writing and you just think, why don't I have a life? Why is it 3 a.m. and I'm trying to write about the Anschluss or trying to write about Proust? Why can't I have a life?
Edmund, I think this conversation has found to end, and so I will allow you to go back to making thousands and thousands and thousands of more vessels that have your fingerprints on them. But the exhibits will be going on at Gagosian. There's This Must Be the Place at Gagosian's 541 West 24th Street location, which opens September 13th. And To Light and Then Return at 976 Madison Avenue. That's the kind of the call and response with Sally Mann. That's September 14th to October 28th. Edmund, it's been such a delight to get to speak with you today.
This kind of dinner party, Craig, invite me again. I've absolutely loved it. It's been a complete and utter pleasure. Thank you so much for doing it.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.